Hello, and welcome back to my channel, or welcome if it's your first time here. I'm Lydia. I'm a commercial artist. I do pattern and surface design primarily. I create designs that I print on products like recipe binders, wrapping paper, stationery, greeting cards, and I sell them in my Etsy shop and on my own website. My business is called The Illustrated Life, if you're curious, and I will put the link in my description below so you can check it out if you're interested. I haven't focused a lot on my work yet, or creating art in my vlogs. It's something I intend to do more in the future. And so today's vlog is going to be a little different than what I've been making, but I hope you'll enjoy it. It's a scripted vlog. I haven't done a scripted vlog yet. I've done like unscripted sit-downs in front of the camera to talk about projects or travel, but I haven't done a vlog that is strictly focused on one topic where I've written an outline, which I've done for this vlog. So I have an outline, and I kind of feel like I'm back in speech class in high school, but I'm talking to a camera instead of a bunch of people. And I can also edit out all of my silly gaffes and awkward pauses. Back in March, before I had even committed to starting a YouTube channel, I put a poll on my Instagram story asking if anyone would be interested in a video covering this topic, and 16 people, including my dad, said yes, so this video is for them. But this video is also for any beginner watercolor artists or who are interested in painting watercolor, or are beginner watercolor artists who are overwhelmed by the supplies aisle at the art store and don't know which. Hopefully it will help elucidate getting started with watercolor, because I know for myself I was very stuck there. Let's discuss paints. I have been painting with watercolor for 10 years now. I don't know when I decided I wanted to be an artist. It's always been a very innate desire for me. When I was really little, I had watercolor paints, and at some point we used up or got rid of those palettes and we didn't paint again. It was probably a really messy activity for my mom to manage. At the age of like 8 or 9, I read a story where the protagonist was competing for a paint box in a competition at her school, and I developed a fixation on getting a paint box. So I went to the store and I spent some of my precious money on a Crayola set, and I was very disappointed with it. I felt like I couldn't make anything good with it. I probably had really high expectations for what I'd be able to make too, which tracks because I'm still that way. But I was probably also painting on printer paper, where you should not use printer paper for watercolor. And after that, I didn't try again. I had colored pencils. They're very laborious and tedious, and I don't like using them to this day, but that's what I mostly made art with between the ages of like 9 and 14. I had a set of acrylic paints, but I didn't know how to use them. I had no one to explain them to me. So fast forward to the age of like 14, I was still drawing. I always did a lot of drawing. I went to a girl from my church who had taken art lessons and was a pretty talented artist. And I was getting pointers from her on things like perspective and composition and proportions for drawing people. And she looked at my artwork and suggested that watercolor would be a good fit for my art style. And she actually gave me my first set of paints, and they were watercolor pencils, so not conventional watercolor paints. And I think she expected me to use them in a normal watercolor pencil style, which is where you color directly on the page, and then you come back with a brush and kind of like spread it around. And I've actually never used watercolor pencils that way. I've always rubbed them or like shaved them into a palette and then reconstituted them with a brush and used them like traditional paints. I don't do that anymore, just for the record. After like a year of using them, I decided I wanted to upgrade. But when I went to the store, I was really puzzled by the options that were available. You could either buy a really expensive boxed set, and like I say, expensive is relative. I'm going to make suggestions in this video about what you should purchase, and it's probably going to cost you between $25 and $50 to get a complete painting setup, just depending on like the most basic setup, depending on the number of paints you want, the quality of paints, kinds of brushes, number of brushes, etc. It's not cheap. You can get really cheap stuff, but I feel like at some point the low quality of your tools is going to hold back your art. So what I'm going to suggest are like student grade and above. These are all things I've used before, and I can personally vouch for the quality of them. And what those palettes contain little squares of hardened, dried watercolor pigments called half pans. And I wasn't willing then to shell out a large amount of money for a palette with all the half pans in it. And none of the art stores I was going to, or that are available to me, sell half pans. They all sell tubes of watercolor that look like this. And this is liquid paint. I did not know how to use them. These were a mystery to me. And so I had to ask my friend, how do you use those? And she was like, well, you squeeze them into a palette, you let it dry, and then you have paint. And that is so simple in hindsight, but I did not know, and I couldn't figure it out when I started. When I was just looking at this, it didn't make sense to me. So that's like mystery one that was unlocked that really allowed me to move forward with painting with watercolors. I would actually recommend starting out with one of those little boxed palettes. They're going to have a nice variety of paints in a full spectrum of colors. It's going to come in a box that will serve as storage and as a palette, so you won't have to buy a palette. And oftentimes they come with a brush, so you'll have at least one brush to start out with. That and a block of student watercolor paper, and you're good to go. You can literally start watercolor painting just with that. But I'm going to share what I use. As far as paint brands go, I'm partial to Winsor & Newton. They're widely available. Their professional watercolor paints are kind of an industry standard. I've seen many watercolor artists using them. And I started out with watercolor paint in tubes. I went with Winsor & Newton Cotman Color. These are the student grade paints that are from the brand Winsor & Newton. That was such a ridiculously long way to say that. If you can afford to, I would opt to start with fewer colors of the better level of quality, because once you buy these and use them, they work well, they're fine, but these reconstitute much easier than the Cotman colors, and the pigments are more vibrant. And if you buy a bunch of the Cotman colors and then you invest in just one of the professional colors, you're going to wish so badly that you could have all of these. And these paints last a really long time. They're expensive, but they'll last you for years. It's gonna feel wasteful. Like, I've never used up this entire tube. I still have some left in here, and that was definitely the case for me. I was like, I don't like this formula anymore. I want the better quality ones. And then it feels wasteful because you're like, but I have to use these up because they're so expensive. So if you can swing it, just start out with the Winsor & Newton professional ones. And if you can only afford one color, just get one color. Just start with blue or black or red or something vibrant that you can get a spectrum of shades in, and practice painting in monochrome. Some of my favorite designs that I've made have been painted in monochrome. And I will say, when it comes to processing, that I have found that blue scans really well, processes really well, and it's very easy to change it to another color and post-processing. I've tried it with green. Green, not so much. I wouldn't recommend green if you're planning to scan your art. I'm going on a rabbit trail, but it was a big lesson for me. If you're wondering what colors to start with, I would start with primary colors. You really only need black, blue, red, yellow, and maybe a brown. A fun alternative to watercolor paint in tubes, if you're looking for something that has really punchy, bright colors, I recommend Dr. P.H. Martin's Hydrus watercolor paints. They come in these little dropper bottles, and these last forever. And they're just a fully pigmented liquid that you can use a lot of it, or you can dilute it and get a lighter color, but these are really great for getting punchy, vibrant colors. This is one of the things I learned from stalking my favorite artists, and I'm just gonna throw a little hack in here. Caitlin Megali, who is a world-class painter, she's done work for brands like Dior and Ralph Lauren, hugely inspirational. She uses these, and she shared a tip once on her Instagram story about mixing a green with this ultramarine and gamboge. Gamboge? These two colors make a really true green that is really easy to make cooler or warmer, and I like it better than any shade of green I've tried from the tubes. So you could also do this with the ultramarine and like a yellow ochre from a tube, but this is a really great way to mix a true green color. You don't need a fancy palette, you just need something that holds the paint and that has a space for you to mix the paint in. You can get porcelain palette. Porcelain is beautiful and very aesthetic. I can see why it's appealing. It's, you know, if it's sealed ceramic, it doesn't absorb the colors and you can clean it really easily. So you can get really deep palettes. Personally, I've tried the deep ones. I don't like them. I find it really awkward to get the paint out of them, and I use this. I've linked this exact palette below. My only complaint is that it's a bit small for me now. I've filled up almost all of these wells. I have a few left, but mostly I struggle with not having enough space to mix colors. So I personally would recommend getting something even bigger, even when you're starting out, because again, this feels like one of those things where it's like, I'm just gonna buy more plastic. This is folding, it shuts, and it completely contains, it's very compact, and I take my art between work and home a lot, so something like this is really ideal for me. And if you're using half pans, I don't know how well they'll work in here. You might want to find something that has, like, I don't know, more square wells. And I think I'm linking to something in the description that will work if you want to like customize your own palette with half pans. Personally, I really like how these wells are sloped. As you can see, they are deeper on one end and they get shallower as you go toward the area where you mix the paint. And that's really ergonomic for mixing the paint and then like just getting one color of paint on your brush. You don't have to worry about it mixing with anything else. It allows you to mix really intentionally, and you almost have like an individual mixing space for each color, which I really like. I know I really emphasized getting high quality paints just to start, but if you absolutely can't afford high quality paints and literally all you can get is a Crayola $2 palette, what will make the world of difference for you is having real watercolor paper. And there are some pretty cheap options available. Just make sure it's watercolor paper and you're off to the races. You really don't need something more complicated than that. A brand that I've used personally and I can vouch for the quality of is Canson paper. These are pretty inexpensive. I think it's like $15 for 30 sheets. And they're like 9 by 12 inches, so you can make a lot of small paintings out of that. To some degree, I just practiced being really intentional about what I was making when I was getting started, because I didn't want to use up and waste all of my precious paper and paints. But to some extent, the process of creating art is it's just a little bit wasteful. Not everything you create is gonna be your best work, and you have to give yourself some freedom to experiment, make mistakes, and mess around. So get some really cheap paper that you don't mind wasting, and then if you want something higher quality for maybe work you're doing for other people or things you want to sell, or for fully fleshed out ideas that you're going to make another copy of, a better brand that still won't break the bank is Strathmore. And I use Strathmore for quite a while. They are available in cold and hot press. So watercolor paper is thicker than just normal paper. And this is specific. I don't really have any like watercolor notepads anymore. Pretty much everything I get is a block. So this is sealed on the edges, and it has a little slit at the top where you can detach the sheet. This is kind of coming apart from the bottom of the block. I will just use my fingernail to detach this, and then it will peel off like so. And this is really great when you're doing something with like a lot of water, it's kind of secured on all ends and it won't warp as badly around the edges. It still might warp a little bit in the middle if you're using a lot of water. This is cold press paper. So as you can see, this watercolor paper has this raised texture. This is Arches paper. This is like one of the most expensive papers you can buy. It's also really great quality. It's 100% cotton, and different brands have different levels of texture. Some are more spread out, some are more dense, but this texture allows the watercolor to kind of grip the paper, and it gives it a pretty distinctive look. On the other hand, there is hot press paper. I don't know what got all over this page. I don't know if I speckled it with paint or something, but this, you can see, this is a very like fine grain. It's like almost imperceptible. It feels very smooth and it doesn't catch the paint as much. I use this a lot because when I am scanning my artwork, those grooves and texture tend to show through on my paintings. Here are two examples of art I created on hot press paper here, and then cold press paper here. So this one has a lot more texture to it. It's much more grippy. At a glance, they don't look much different. I was really struggling with this piece of art. I was really having a hard time getting it to turn out the way I envisioned it. So I tried painting it on cold press as well as hot press paper. And I really liked how this turned out, but when I scanned it, because these details are really small, this grain showed up very clearly. In the process of digitizing, I will remove any white background because it tends to look like gray and cloudy and not very clean. And the distinction between these painted areas with the texture and the white background being removed was just too drastic. Whereas there's a lot less visible texture on hot press paper, and you end up with a much smoother, cleaner product. So I use this a lot of the time. If I'm doing a custom house portrait or a pet portrait, I might use cold press. In fact, I primarily used cold press to do house portraits the first couple of years, and the cheapest brands only come in a cold press texture. I think Strathmore is the most economical brand that offers hot press. The reason I choose to use Arches is because it's 100% cotton, and 100% cotton is more absorbent. It's essentially fabric. In the same way that money is made of fabric, it's actually really durable. It holds up well against watercolor and all of the wetness in the process of watercolor. That's what the best watercolor papers are made from, is 100% cotton. Strathmore has an option for 100% cotton. There are other brands like Fabriano, Artistica, I think, that make cotton paper. If I wasn't doing watercolor for work and it was just a hobby, I would probably opt for something cheaper than Arches. It's extremely expensive. It's a real investment, but it is really, really good quality. It's another thing that I observed artists I like using, and I thought in order to emulate them, I should try it, and I really enjoyed using it. For brushes, you don't need like the most incredible, high quality, expensive, real brushes. Synthetic are just fine. There are some really nice synthetic brushes out there. I invested in some Princeton Heritage brushes a couple of years ago, and I think they work really well, but there are cheaper brushes out there. I've recently started buying cheaper brushes, especially the little ones. They tend to wear out more quickly, and like as soon as the tips are no longer straight, they don't work very well for detail. So I ended up buying like a $2 paintbrush recently for some small details, and it's worked really, really well. So you do not need to spend a ton of money. You don't need to break the bank in order to buy the best of the best brushes. You need a variety of sizes. I have a 00. This is the cheap one I bought recently. This is Marco brand. I have a 0, I have 2, I have another 2, I'm guessing. I have a 6 and a 16 and a 1/2 inch square tipped brush. Historically, I haven't taken the best care of my brushes. one thing I would say is if you're starting out, don't create a habit of setting your brushes in the water and leaving them there, or they will end up like this with this bent tip. And when your tip is bent, they are really difficult to use for details, which is what you want them for. So take better care of your brushes than me. Learn from me. Oh, I have another one. It was hidden. I have a size 10 as well. For drawing, I used to use like HB pencils exclusively, but a couple of years ago, this is another thing that I learned from another artist on the internet. I saw they were using a mechanical pencil, and I love this because it has a really fine tip to use. You don't have to sharpen your pencil all the time. So this is a Statler 92505, and I will link this as well. I also just bought a ruler, just a regular old ruler. I did not know this until recently, so don't come for me. I have been dumping my paint water down the drain for years, and you shouldn't do that. But I did not know this until recently, that there is a proper way to dispose of paint. So I will demonstrate. I have my paint water from yesterday, and it's still pretty green. Like, a lot of the solids have stayed suspended in it, but a lot of them have sunk to the bottom. But what you're supposed to do, apparently, have a coffee, pour over thing here. You don't need a fancy pour over. I just happen to have one that I did buy for coffee. And once your solids have settled to the bottom, you pour the water through a coffee filter, and it will strain out some of whatever's left. It's still not perfect. I have let this sit for quite a while, and it's collected some in the bottom. Thereafter, you can just wipe it out with a paper towel or a rag and dispose of that in the trash. Watercolor paints, not all of them, but some of them contain harmful or toxic chemicals like cadmium. So obviously, you don't want to be dumping that in large amounts down the sink. Let's discuss some other tips, techniques, tools. First off, I'm going to mention line work. I'm pretty sure my friend thought I would use line work in my art when she suggested watercolor to me. Line work is just outlining your art in ink. This can be done before you paint, this can be done after you paint. Usually you'll use a pen that is actually like a permanent marker with a really fine tip. Typically I would use micron pens if I was going to do this, but last year I was introduced to the Uniball Vision Fine Tip waterproof pen, and this thing writes so smoothly and so beautifully that if I did line work in the future, that's probably what I would opt to use over micron pens. I have tried line work. It just isn't my favorite in combination with my art style. I feel like it tends to overpower it, and it's very tedious, and I don't have patience for that. Next up on the list of honorable mentions, things that would be helpful to know about when you're starting out, is masking fluid. So masking comes in a bottle like this, and it's an opaque liquid. That dries on your paper, and this comes in really handy when you want to paint over like a large area without having to go around spots that you want to leave white. A good example of where you might want to use this is in a field of flowers, or you had a pattern that was a solid color with white spots or white lines running through it. This would be a great time to use masking fluid. Paint it on. Once you've added the masking fluid to your paper, you're going to want to let it dry completely. You're not going to want to try to paint over it while it's still wet, or it will just mix into your paint. I would also recommend using an old brush that you don't mind potentially getting ruined. If you clean it off right away, it'll be fine, but I do have brushes that have gotten completely gunked up, and that's really hard to fix. So just don't let your brushes sit with the masking fluid on them. and then you let it dry. And when it's dry, you want to let it fully dry or it won't work. Once the paint is dry, you can use an eraser or your fingertip to rub or peel away the masking fluid, and you'll be left with clean, precise white space in the middle of what's painted over. Tracing paper and light boards are some of my favorite tools for sketching and designing. Tracing paper is essentially a piece of parchment paper. It's see-through. You trace your design on one side with pencil or ink. Ink works best. You're going to flip it over, and then you're going to color over that line, which you'll be able to see through on the other side with pencil. Flip it over again onto a fresh sheet of paper that you want to transfer your design to, and trace over your ink lines. And when you lift up the paper, you'll be left with a pretty good impression of what you wanted to copy. This is useful if you're a heavy-handed sketcher like me. I tend to bear down a lot. I have to go back and do a lot of erasing, but sometimes I'll even leave like indelible marks in my paper. And I'm also a very laborious sketcher. I don't really sketch things quickly and easily, so often I'll try to sketch out my final design on a piece of paper and then use tracing paper or a light board to transfer it to the watercolor paper, so I don't ruin the watercolor paper before I've ever gotten to painting it. I used tracing paper for many years before investing in a light board. A light board is just a flat LED screen that is durable enough to withstand pressure, and it works kind of the same way, but it cuts out the second and third steps, and you pretty much just have to trace. Finally, I want to discuss scanners. So a scanner is pretty vital to creating a digitized version of your artwork. You can take a photo either with a high quality camera, or you can even take it with your phone camera, but the quality is not going to be as good as it would be if you were taking a scan. Certainly if you're using a phone. A better camera would probably suffice. I have a Canon LIDE 400 or LIDE 400, and this works pretty well. I think it takes up to like a 9 by 12 inch piece of artwork. It would be fantastic to have a larger one because sometimes I want to do a larger piece of artwork than that, but I can usually fix that in post-processing. I like to scan my artwork at 600 DPI. It allows you to scale up the artwork while retaining its quality, so you can literally make it at any size, even if you painted a really small piece of artwork to begin with. I think I'd need to make a whole other video about post-processing and how I edit my videos, so if that's something that would interest anyone, please leave a comment and tell me. That would probably make a really great topic for a future video. And I'll just add here that some kind of post-processing is necessary when you scan, because it takes a very clear, accurate picture of your artwork, but the lighting is usually different than it looks in real life and how you pictured it. So that may not seem obvious. Of course, it seems obvious to me because I've been doing this for years, but just like the watercolor in the tubes, you never know what just flies over your head when you're getting started and isn't clear until someone explains it. So I'll just leave that comment there. It's kind of like editing photos, but to clean up the background takes some extra time and tools that I would love to make a video out of. So if anyone's interested in a video about how I post-process my art and digitalize it, then leave a comment and tell me, and maybe that will be the topic of my next art video, who knows. I hope this video was helpful to someone. Hopefully it was informative and maybe just an interesting thing to turn on in the background, even if you're watching this and you're not an artist. Thanks for spending the time to watch this, and maybe you learned something. Maybe you're more interested in starting watercolor than you were a half hour ago, or however long this video is. I'm assuming it's going to be pretty long. I think that pretty much covers all the basics of everything I use day to day, week to week in my watercolor creating process. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Hello there, and welcome to the exciting world of hip.
1, 2, 3, 4.